Madam Speaker, Alison Johnston, Member of Parliaments from all over the world, Excellencies, Vice President Al Gore, Lawrence Tubania. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be speaking here in the Scottish Parliament. I thank Globe for this opportunity. I stand here today as an elected representative of one of the most vulnerable countries on earth. I do not just represent my constituents as a member of parliament or my parliament as its speaker or my nation as its former president. I also represent the Climate Vulnerable Forum, a group of 55 most climate vulnerable development countries around the world. We include Bangladesh, the current chair, and the Philippines, Kenya, and many small states like my own. In total, we are 1.2 billion people, many of them among the poorest, who are in the front line of the current climate emergency. No point of ground in my country, the Maldives, is more than a couple of meters above the sea level. We are already seeing our coast eroding as the seas rise and the waves eat away at more and more of our land. We are living in a planet of 1.2 degrees, heated above the Industrial Revolution. We now know that the winds are stronger, the waves are higher, the summers are longer, the rain is more, our coral reefs have bleached, we have lost our biodiversity, we have lost the bait fish and therefore our tuna fishery industry. Our water is contaminated and we have to desalinate our water. We are already seeing more impacts of climate change than many generations have ever seen in our countries. That is why COP26 is so important. Because as I said at the outset of the meeting, it represents our last hope of keeping 1.5 degree Paris goal alive. This goal of keeping temperatures from crossing 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is essential if any of our corals are to survive in their natural state. It is essential if my nation is to stay above the sea level. And it is also essential if other nations of the Climate Vulnerable Forum are not to be similarly wiped off the face of the earth by drought or by fire or flood. So we are now 5 days into the COP. It seems like longer. I am mostly in the COP when I am not in prison, which is very often. So as a COP regular, let me take stock and share with you my thoughts about how things are going. I'm also not in COP when I am victim of an assassination attempt. When we came here, there was a mood of pessimism. We pushed back against that. Pessimism achieves nothing. determination is the right attitude to have at the start of such an important gathering. And we have seen some encouraging outcomes already. Top of the list for me would be Prime Minister Modi's pledge in the opening ceremony. He talked about 5 elixirs. And for us, they might very well be elixirs of life. India has said it will now have 50% of renewables and 500 gigawatts of clean energy by 2030. And when my friend, the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, says this, I believe him. I know he does not talk empty words. I now fully expect India to be in the lead of a global clean energy revolution. There is a revolution happening. We are on the brink of another technological industrial revolution, a green revolution. If you do not embrace the new technology, you cannot be the leaders of tomorrow. If you want to be burdened with the obsolete Victorian technology of the internal combustion engine, well, you can be part of the forgotten history. If you want to move forward, you have to be a leader and lead your people. The number crunchers have looked at this increased target for India and other pledges, and the 2.7 degrees that we expected when we came into COP has now been reduced to 1.9 degrees. If you add in the 0.3 degrees for the methane pledge, and perhaps some more for the agreement to stop deforestation, I think we are within sight of the 1.5 degree goal here in Glasgow. But there remains a gap between paper pledges and climate reality. According to the Global Carbon Project, emissions have now fully rebounded from the small drop seen last year after the COVID. And coal has been in the lead. This is what matters in the real world. Coal is killing our countries. We must close the gap between ambition and reality, and that means delivering on the pledges we have heard. Net zero in 2050, 2060, 2070 is important, and I welcome these long-term commitments. They show that we will exit the fossil fuel age and that the clean energy revolution is already unstoppable. No one should be financing new fossil fuels. It is not just destroying the planet, it is a poor investment as well. World Bank, the IMF, the multilateral organizations should not be lending money for fossil fuel investments. The bank should not come to the Maldives with a plan to have an LNG plant or a diesel generator. They show that the long-term pledges show that we will exit the fossil fuel age and that the clean energy revolution is simply unstoppable. But we are running out of time. At current emission, the world will have burnt through the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees in just 11 years. So it is short-term action that counts now. It is action now. It is immediate action that must bend the curve for our survival. That is why we, the CVF are calling for not just a regular COP outcome, but something that represents a radical departure from business as usual. We want to see a Glasgow Climate Emergency Pact. This would establish annual climate emergency ambition platforms for 2030, ambition at each COP between 2022 and 2025. This would be for enhancing ambition beyond just the NDCs, not every 5 years, but every year. Because in the climate emergency, every year counts, every month counts, every minute counts. We also need to focus on finance, because without a delivery plan for $500 billion by 2024, developing countries will lose faith and goodwill. The financing promises we made a long time ago, and they must be fulfilled by the end of COP26. Finance also must be split 50-50 between mitigation and adaptation, because our nations are already facing loss and damage for climate impacts every year. I am proud that the Maldives had put forward 2030 carbon neutral goal. We stand willing, but we can't do this alone. And this is where you as parliamentarians come in. Leaders have made a pledge. You as parliamentarians know how to deliver a pledge through legislations. We go out during elections, we pledge to the people. To realize that pledge, you need a legislative agenda that will give you the procurement orders and the tender notices. And that is where parliaments come in. We must always remember that we answer to the people who elected us. I spent half my adult life in jail. I have the scars, and too many of them, to prove it. So let us make sure that parliaments and elected representatives are central to all the work we do on climate. It won't happen in any other place other than here. In the Maldives, as Speaker of the Maldives Parliament, I have encouraged the passage of the Climate Emergency Bill. That act prescribes a pathway to net zero in the Maldives. Like the flagship UK Act, it stipulates the establishment of a carbon budget for each calendar year in order to meet the 2030 goal. This makes our target legally binding and establishes the mechanism for reaching it. This way, our parliament is bridging the gap between ambition and reality. We have legislated an energy legislation that would allow for power purchasing agreements and feed-in tariff systems. That would make us switch to renewables. That would give us the infrastructure to deliver solar panels and renewable power. We have enacted a Water and Sewerage Act that would again deliver safe water and regulations on how to dispose of your waste. We have amended the Environment Act to stop the import of plastics to the Maldives. I wish that other parliaments could lead in this way, not just in declaring climate emergencies, but in setting out in legislation how government must meet their promises. Maldives Parliament stand willing to assist any parliamentarians among you who wish to implement similar legislations. We are small. We are in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and you can't probably find us on a map, but we know how to do this. We can get it done. We know how to deliver a pledge through legislations. We are quite willing to work with you. I am very happy that we have Globe as a partner. And I note that our act, despite all political differences on other issues, we actually fight in the parliament on other issues. We throw punches. But in this one, we all came together and it passed unanimously. Because if there is one thing we can agree on, it is our survival. I will not sign a suicide note for my nation, and none of us will sign a suicide note for our world. Despite all our differences, we all know what the outcome must be. Let us unite and let us use the power of parliaments to deliver 1.5 degrees. Let us save this planet. We are the generation to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker Nasheed. We now have an opportunity for you to put your questions to our keynote speakers. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And once invited to speak, if you're on the floor of the chamber, could you please wait for the red light on the microphone to come on, and please stand if you're able to do so. If you're in the gallery, please make your way to one of the freestanding microphones. And for those delegates who are joining online, please enter your question or comment into the question and answer box. And could all delegates please introduce themselves by saying their name and organisation. And if everyone could keep their questions as succinct as possible, we'll be able to get more people in. So please, who would like to put the first question? We have Speaker Nasheed and we have Lawrence Tubiani online.
There's no microphone for that.
So I'm going to the Isle of Man first.
You can hear me. Dewan Watterson, Speaker of the House of Keys in the Isle of Man, but also representing here as Vice Chairman of the Small Branches Network of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Two questions, fellow Speaker. Where did you start on this journey? And because obviously you're now at a rather advanced stage of getting to your planning for 2030, but where did you actually start? What was the early part of that journey? And as a small nation, how did you get heard? Because that's the problem for the poorest and for the smallest to even be heard in the first place. So how have you achieved that? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We were the first generation to actually see coral because goggles and masks came to the Maldives during the early 70s. So we were the first generation to actually see the thing, and we are also the generation to see it die. And so I think where we started, or rather I started, would have been seeing the coral. And how did I get heard? By line and non-stop being at it, continuously being at it. I became president very young. I was elected into parliament also very young. So I've had a long innings. It's been now 20 years as a politician, and so I have been speaking a lot. I suppose when you have the line and the length, you're bound to get that wicket. Just keep at it.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from the Parliament of Uganda. If you could stand, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Christine Kayana Chimwero, Chiwaga District Woman Member of Parliament from Uganda. Thank you very much for sharing. Putting our countries to fulfillment of these ambitious targets requires us to fulfill the democratic principles. Many of our countries were doing badly as far as fulfillment of leadership, team meetings, the freedom to protest and petition, and also the freedom to giving feedback and as well invest in renewables is still a challenge. So we are requesting for your advice. Many of the countries, when they wanted to embrace certain things, a lot of developed countries supported them. Others, when they didn't want to go ahead with some social practices like homosexuality, we saw countries standing up against us like Uganda. What is happening right now when there is no democracy? We don't seem, as parliamentarians, to put our countries on what? On fulfillment of some of these ambitious targets. So democracy first. Help us come up with that.
Well, thank you very much, Madam. I always say that democracy is the most important adaptation measure. If without it, you will be doing the wrong project at the wrong time, at the wrong place, at the wrong price. And we will be probably harming the environment more. How you deliver a pledge and how you come out with government procurement orders that would finally implement projects is through democracy. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly is most important. There's no point even trying on this without democracy. If our people are not able to say what they want to say, do what they want to do, then it is hardly possible for us to galvanize them, for us to get them working on it. It's their thing. It's not ours. None of our leaders have a right to do any of the things. We are here only because we are elected. And I completely agree with you, and I am aware of your situation. And it's very good that you have raised it. I hope that your point will be amplified.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a further 2 questions and then we'll be moving on to the next session. I will indeed. I'm going to take these 2 questions together. First of all, we can hear from the Parliament of Tuvalu and then the Parliament of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. I come from a country called Tuvalu, which is only a very small island, which is about 26 square kilometers in total land area, with a population of about 11,000 people, situated about 600 miles north of Fiji Islands, between Australia and New Zealand. Right now, we are actually feeling the crunch of sea level rise. Our airfield, when it is king tide, is already 40% filled with water. We are already feeling the crunch of sea level rise. And I would like to ask you, sir, as to what will be your advice at the moment. Adaptation has to be done right now. And there is no more need for talk. We need action. We have to build up our country to elevate it to a higher level in order for us to survive the impact of this climate change and sea level rise. Thank you.
Thank you, MP. Even if we all go back to sleep and never wake up, we're not going to have Tuvalu. Because the poison is already trapped and the bad weather is already upon us. Tuvalu cannot survive at 1.2 degrees. Tuvalu cannot survive if we continue even to 1.5. The only option for Tuvalu, and if we can't do this, we are in trouble. Only option for Tuvalu would be to raise the island, to find hard adaptation. I don't usually advocate for hard adaptation. We must find nature-based solutions. And that is the only solution. But Tuvalu now needs a hybrid. It needs to be reclaimed. I am told that it's going to cost about $200 million. And I'll be very sad if that money actually doesn't come. There is a Dutch company, 150 years old. They have good adaptation practices, nature-based and hard. And I think it really falls upon all of us to save Tuvalu. I am aware of your predicament and your sadness, how you would have to jump on a boat and then find dry land. There are 50 million islanders. A quarter of the world's population is living on the coastline. They will all be on the move. We can't be this naive. We can't be this silly. We cannot be idiots. We must think, we must believe the science. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from the Parliament of South Africa, and then I will go to Senator Galvez. Thank you.
Well, good morning to you, Honourable Presiding Officer and Honourable Speaker. My name is Cedric Frolic. I'm a Member of Parliament from the Republic of South Africa, where I'm a Presiding Officer and also co-chairing the Steering Committee on Climate Change. Recently, South Africa deposited its new NDCs with the UNFCCC, which is very ambitious and aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 27% by 2030. However, equally important is an ambitious multilateral commitment to financial resources as well as technological transfers to implement a just transition. What is your views on the crucial elements that is required to effect a just transition so that we do not leave anyone behind? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very often it is the lack of legislation. Yes, there is a lack of commitment from developed countries. They don't want to give money that easily, and I can understand that as well. You don't want to be giving money to buy Mercedes-Benzes and having a good life for our leaders. We want the money to go to exactly where it should be going. And to do that, we need the legislations. South Africa is an example in legislations. South Africa is one of the oldest parliaments, in fact. And it has the possibility to deliver it. And I think there's also the question of trust for us. What are we doing to our own people? How are we doing it? And I think that would also make rich countries easy, to make it easy for the political leaders here to deliver it to our people. And I think, democracy, therefore, is crucial. My advice always is to have transparency and democracy, and also make sure that the rich countries are brought to account on their own pledges. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to hear from Senator Rosa Galvez. Thank you.
Much for the opportunity to speak in this space. I am an independent senator at the Canadian Parliament, but I wear several hats. I'm also Peruvian origin, so my country, my natal country, is losing the glaciers in the Andes. So they are losing the storage of drinking water. We know that we have to transition and that we are not going into a fast pace and that the climate is havoc and is destroying, and every year it's cost more expensive. And non-government at non-level have money put aside for these events that are more and more destructive. So Paris was for the pledges, and Glasgow is to implement. And we know that if politicians don't deliver, that is an attack to democracy because people lose the trust in democracy. So now talking about finances, I know that there is a lot of focus on how the climate change is impacting the stability of the finances. I am here to say that the finances are also, because of the bad decision of continuing financing fossil fuels, as you mentioned, is feeding the climate emergency. So we have to push in parallel many places. Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Thank you. 17 countries yesterday agreed not to lend on fossil fuel. Renewable energy is now economically viable, financially feasible. And again, with India's commitment to switch to renewables in 20 years, 50% of their energy needs, would, I believe, drive the market and make it more attractive. The climate vulnerable countries have a prosperity plan that they want to implement. 33 countries want to implement that in their countries. That calls for less extraction, more recycling, and with the same economic outcomes. High employment, GDP growth, low inflation, but without rubbishing the planet, without relying on fossil fuel. I think the time is coming. Again, this is another height of naivety for countries and leaders and industry to think that they can go on pushing fossil fuel on us. No, it's not going to happen. Countries said that they are not going to fund coal abroad. It's primarily because they haven't been able to sell the thing. No one is buying it. Recently, there was a tender in Bombay for a power plant, and the renewable energy bid is cheaper. So we will have high ambition political leaders saying many things now because the economics have shifted. It's when it was a moral argument, a human rights argument, an ethical argument, we didn't see political leaders. Well, excuse me, we are all that. But we didn't see many of them coming out and giving pledges. But now, when it is economically feasible, and you cannot now adapt your budget without actually having a line for renewables, then it would happen. So I think it's madness if leaders think that they can still rely on coal. It's changed.
Thank you. Now, we are over time, such is the interest in this subject. I am going to take another 2 questions, but I'd be very grateful if the questions could be succinct, and I'm going to have to ask for shorter responses too, just because of timing. But I know we're all thoroughly enjoying this session. I'll call Mr Gardner from the UK Parliament, and then I'll come to yourself. Thank you.
Sir, Madam Presiding Officer, thank you very much for extending the session and allowing me to speak. I'm Barry Gardner from the UK Parliament. I want to thank you, sir, and the small island developing states for the the moral and political leadership that you have always given to the process. I think it's been quite outstanding. And one of the other leaders in this, again from an island state, from Barbados, spoke at the beginning of COP, and she spoke, this is of course Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, spoke of the three gaps: the gap in mitigation, in finance and adaptation. But there's another gap, and it's been highlighted by our colleague from Tuvalu here today. And that is the gap, the glaring gap that has been infecting the COP for so long, and that is the gap over people speaking out about loss and damage. And I wonder if you could give us your thoughts about the need for loss and damage to be properly addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, you didn't invent the internal combustion engine to murder me. It was the technology came to eradicate poverty, to have a good life, to develop. But later on we found out that this was actually poisoning us. I try not to frame climate change negotiations in anti-imperial language. I believe that we are all here together. We've all done it wrong. Of course, countries who've got richer, I mean, I'm standing here in Edinburgh, and who had probably extracted more resources throughout the world. It's the Scottish engineering that was extracting everything, everywhere. And now that we've come to understand that this was wrong, I think the nice thing to do would be to acknowledge that and try to help each other. I don't want to ask for a reparation or a damage, but I think the facts are clear. It's up to you to realize what's happened and not me to point it out.
Thank you. And we're going to move to our final question in this session, and I call Zephyra Berman, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you these 2 days. I look forward to speaking to you tomorrow. I have a quick question for both of our keynote speakers. I'd like to ask your advice on how we work to close the loophole that we're seeing in many of the commitments here at COP26. I think you made reference to the 20 countries yesterday on their finance commitments, which of course is a huge step forward. I'm concerned to see the language in that my own country's commitment there, I'm from Canada, on unabated. And again, I think that flags an issue that we're also seeing in GFANs and in the net zero commitments from our countries and from companies, which is a loophole that allows, it's like we've gone from denial to delusion, that carbon capture and storage and nature-based sequestration, the cumulative modeling that we have, will allow us to continue to increase fossil fuel production and emissions. How do we ensure that the definitions of net zero and these financial commitments lead to absolute emission and production decline?
Through legislation. Madam, through legislation. We have a Climate Emergency Act in the Maldives. Our government said that they are going to be net zero in 2030. And we've locked that in. So that's linked to the budget. That's linked to your procurement orders, tender notices, housing programs, schools, education. I think we should promote these legislations throughout all the political parties and parliaments. I'm also positive about this, optimistic about this. I don't think come next election people can actually canvass votes without environment pledges. So this is good. But it's sad that it had to come to where, 200 people dying in Germany, 300 people dying in Belgium, tundra burning, Poland burning, fire and floods everywhere in Europe, high winds. But it had to come to this. And I am sorry, the planet is very obviously losing its balance. It is going to go to a tipping point, whether we like it or not. And politicians will have to pledge. And I think the legislation will come. I don't think they can form a government in, for instance, Germany, without a heavy infusion of green. I think it's coming. We are on the brink, and we are going to witness this sea change. Hopefully, in the process, saving Tuvalu, the Maldives, low-lying islands, and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like, if you would join me, thanking former Vice President Gore, Lawrence Tubiana, and Speaker Nasheed, who has spent so much time answering your questions so well. Thank you all for your questions. And I'm going to, if we can thank our speakers. Thank you.